and we're going to record this event. I was supposed to turn that on a little bit ago, but I didn't. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Matt, Amy, and just a reminder, if you do have questions that come up while they're speaking, it would be quickest and easiest if you just type those in the chat, and then we'll answer. We'll have an answering question and answer session after their basic part of their program. So let's go ahead and turn it over, and we'll go from there.
Hey everybody, can everyone see the screen?
Yes.
Oh, no, okay. Okay, now does it look more like a presentation?
No.
How about now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for welcoming Amy and I to your community meeting tonight. We are excited to present to you about the nature preserve system, biodiversity, DeKalb Prairie, and what people in Illinois can and have been doing about biodiversity conservation in the state. And so as an Audubon chapter, you of course all know a lot about this, but maybe there are some other local regional initiatives in your state that you didn't know quite about yet. And this one is a newer organization that is trying to perpetuate sort of an old idea of volunteer stewardship. Not an old idea, but one that was also pioneered here in Illinois. So we take a lot of pride in our volunteer stewardship in the way we know it in the modern world. So in this presentation, we will have a lot of photos to basically tour you around the nature preserve system a little bit so that you can get an idea of what some of these places that are far away or really rich look like. So these preserves are, as it says here in this slide, more than just a park. A state park or any other kind of park. They are different. And so here is a picture that Amy grabbed this morning when out birding. Couple of scavengers going after a carcass of some kind. And
she took a nice picture just this morning.
So we will just share that with you. And then today's takeaways from this presentation are going to include what a nature preserve is and why they are important, what biodiversity is and how it's represented in Illinois, who the Friends of the Nature Preserves are and why this group formed in the first place and what that group does, how Illinois Audubon members and communities can work with and conserve nature preserve sites and locally and statewide, and then where to find important information about all of this work. So Illinois as a biodiversity hotspot. I grew up in Illinois, and that's not what I would have called it if you had talked to me 10 years ago. But I've since learned a lot about biodiversity after college and through college and then getting a job and working in conservation because I am inspired by Illinois' biodiversity. We are at the confluence of three major biomes of the North American continent: the northern hardwood forests, the eastern tallgrass prairie, and to some extent the mixed grass prairie, and then the eastern forest, the eastern deciduous forest to our east. And so here at the confluence of these ecosystems, we have a very rich environment. We will talk about all of these, or we'll go through these and talk about their richness and how Illinois really is a web of life that's much larger than you see most of the time. So the corn and soybeans and reed canary grass that you drive by is what I mean. And this is a prairie in spring. This is a prairie in May. Much of Illinois used to look like this. These are shooting stars, pucoons, and grassland birds, you can imagine, do well here. Lots of insects for the insectivores. Here we have the tall grass prairie a little later in the season, maybe around June or July. The richness just continues. And all the diverse colors and textures are represented in each season of the year for the tallgrass prairie. It is one of the richest biomes on the planet, and it has a great feature that I like to tell people about, which is that it's like the rainforest, only upside down, as most of this biodiversity actually is underground in 16, 20-foot root systems in some cases. That can be perennial grasslands up thousands of years old. So here's a remnant Dolomite prairie. So these are very rare bedrock prairies where the soil is very thin and close to the geologic bedrock. Here we have prairies like hill prairies out near Northwest Illinois, Harlem Hills. This is a gravel prairie similar to Bell Bowl Prairie, which we'll talk about later. Amy took this great photo, the sky and the tall grass. Here over the Mississippi River and its floodplain farms is Illinois Ozarks Nature Preserve. These hill prairies are 300 feet up in the air, and they've been dry, arid landscapes for thousands of years. Remnant prairies and rich ecosystems. Some of the only places that still support the biodiversity of the Mississippi Bluffs in Illinois. Here we have savannas. So now we're going to transition to another ecotype here in Illinois called the savanna, which is a grassland with trees mixed in, usually nearer to the woodlands of our state, which were found along the water courses and still can be. So here early in the spring, this is wood betony blooming its own Prairie Grove Nature Preserve. A few weeks later, the same spot, this will look like phlox and foxglove beard tongues and some fleabane, daisy fleabanes. And then a little later in the season, yet more biodiversity as we go. So this web of life in our nature preserve system is what represents the web of life that used to be in Illinois before settlement and the cultivation and development of the landscape into what you see today. Here's Bluff Spring Fen Nature Preserve, another savanna. Illinois Beach State Park, which is a nature preserve. And we will get to the definition of a nature preserve, don't worry. We're just going on a little tour right now to talk about how rich our wonderful state is. In our woodlands, we have deciduous woodlands in Illinois. That means that the trees change color and the leaves fall every year, which is not true of pine and boreal forests, coniferous forests. And so here we have the rich understory of the spring woods, important for bumblebee queens, just like it is out in the prairie. These queens need these resources. And Illinois used to have resources in every woodland and every prairie for the whole growing season. And now our fragmented, degraded ecosystems don't necessarily represent this biodiversity across the whole state. They are contained in small preserves that have been protected in order to protect, study, and value this biodiversity. So biodiversity is valuable to all of us in Illinois. Rich, healthy ecosystems for a number of reasons, from everything from economic, cultural identity, climate solutions. We have human health impacts, maybe are the biggest draw for why people should care about landscapes that are biodiverse, rich, full of different textures, colors, wetnesses, and seasonal variation. That's because healthy habitats help to buffer human populations from disease. That's a pretty hot topic right now. There's deforestation accelerating climate change. And what you should know is that in our state, we used to have a lot of grassland, and we still do. It's mostly in annual crops now. Corn is a grass, and it is still, you could call Illinois a grassland, but it is not the kind that is resilient to change, and it is not the kind that provides a lot of ecosystem services. It is a monoculture for the most part. And a biodiverse landscape will filter water, and nutrient recycling processes will be intact. There's a lot of buffer to the natural world's rainstorms, snowstorms, and without that, human populations are a bit more vulnerable to all sorts of expensive and deadly things. And so biodiversity for human health really does make a difference in our land, and maybe most importantly for our grandkids, our legacy. If we leave something that's scraped bare, what are they going to live on? And so here in Kishwaukee Fen Nature Preserve, in the dead of winter, you can see the groundwater spring here keeps this water 54 degrees all year long, so it does not freeze. And then in the Great Lakes region, we have our dunes, a very, very special inland sea type ecotype that is surrounding freshwater coastlines, which is something pretty unique in the world. We don't have a lot of lakes like the Great Lakes, of course, and so the associated dunes and woodlands, prairies that are along these sandy shores are very rich, and actually some of the most endangered of our ecosystems, because Illinois has such a short coastline. that almost everything is developed, and therefore in Illinois, a consequence of that is that a lot of the beach plants and animals are rare. So down in southern Illinois, there are swamps, in northern Illinois, bogs. These are rich places. And so I'm showing you all of this, because it's fun to look at the nature in Illinois, and this group likes that, but also to show you that the richness in Illinois is far greater than most people see when they're driving their car and experiencing Illinois that way. And so when you get out into the preserves and see these fragmented areas that are left, but how rich they are, you can really get a good understanding for what this place used to look like, what this landscape used to look like. There are so many rare plants in our nature preserves and animals that they really are the strongholds of the biodiverse landscape that was Illinois and still is only in these fragments. And so these biodiversity preserves are important because they house dozens of unique natural communities. You just saw a lot of photos. Each one of those photos was a community. It wasn't just a specific species. That was a whole web of life. And that was only above ground that I showed you in those photos. And so these thousands of species of native organisms, they are special in themselves. They have an innate value, an innate right to live. That is an ethical point of view that conservationists across the world typically adopt, which is that just like you and I would say we have a right to live, so do these ecosystems. And if you disagree with that and you think that people don't have a right to live, that is also represented well in nature, as nature has ethically decided that predator-prey relationships are okay, or ethical, perhaps you might say. And so we have this moral imperative to conserve this biodiverse web of life in Illinois. And at the moment, everyone knows there's about 0.01% of the prairie left in Illinois. And that was our main ecosystem type. And so healthy ecosystems are vital to us, to biodiversity, and therefore these resources are important to the world because they are in such small numbers and they represent so much unique diversity. And who knows what genetics and other processes by the fungi, microbiota, and other birds and animals working together in a web will influence science, industry, and technology in the future. So these are important places. And so one thing that I need to make sure we have a bit of a reality check here is that I talked about how there's 1/100% left of the natural ecosystem, the prairie in Illinois. That is also has consequences across different, what we call trophic levels. That means different levels of the food system, food web, and so the web of life. And so here, the bird web of life we'll talk about. Monocultures across our state and the depletion of grassland habitat has contributed to, and what Audubon, the magazine, calls here loss of more than 1 in 4 birds in the last 50 years in North America. So the work you guys are doing through Audubon is really important, because what does that mean? That means that for migratory birds like Baltimore Orioles, 2 in 5 have been lost since 1970. Grassland birds, 3 in 4. When you leave 1/100%, 1/100% of the grassland, this is what you get. We wind up with a very steep decline. With the rise of pesticides for our monoculture agriculture practices, we lose so many insects that the next part of the food web, the aerial insectivores, also declines. And so in all, biodiversity, we're in a crisis right now. This is important work because right now there are so many declines across the board. We call it the Great Simplification. But we still have places that are holdouts, places where nature exists, places called the Illinois Nature Preserves. This is a great system that was born in Illinois, and these are biodiversity conservation areas that are permanently preserved. That's part of their legal powers, that they're preserved permanently as holdings. And they can be owned by the public or private entities. And one of the parts of this system is that it was enacted by law in the Natural Areas Preservation Act in 1963, which was revolutionary for its time, and preserved these places in perpetuity, recognizing how little was left. And so the state came together and we were able to pass this bill in 1963 that preserves these sites as in their best and most valuable use to the people as they are just now. And so in order for people in Illinois to envision and experience the primeval conditions in a wilderness-like environment, they also contribute generally to the public health and welfare of the environmental quality of the state. And so this is all written in Illinois law. And areas dedicated as nature preserves are hereby declared to be put in their highest and best and most important use for the public. Again, sorry, I repeated that, but that is an important line that has held strong. Here's Soame Prairie Grove Nature Preserve. This is almost the height of summer, right before the tall grass prairie gets tall, butterfly milkweed and lead plant, bees, birds, snakes, coyotes. This is the biodiversity we're talking about in our nature preserve system. These are the places that still have their richness and were identified as the richest parcels left in the state over the last 50 years. And so, or more than that, almost 60 years. And so these preserves are not the same as a forest preserve or a state park. They are sometimes overlapping with those holdings, but they are permanently protected. They are overseen by the Illinois Nature Preserve Commission, and they must be registered on the Illinois Natural Areas Inventory first, which is a system that inventories the natural areas that are left to our state in good condition and in what condition they are in. And so the preserves are not necessarily owned by the state. If you own a very rich prairie in your backyard that's an original prairie, you could dedicate it as a nature preserve and receive tax benefits. The INPC, the Nature Preserve Commission, approves the dedications and oversees the easements, and that's the legal part of the nature preserves. So a land and water reserve is the nature preserve light version to allow for more recreational activities on these preserves. As these preserves are for nature, yes, they're for people to experience primeval Illinois as it is written in the law, but they are for nature to be conserved over time, over the long run. That's why that perpetuity word is used. And so the Illinois Land and Water Reserves allow for a little bit more flexibility for a landowner to register to preserve land, get incentives for it, but they can allow for snowmobiling, something like that. Many places that are called nature preserves are not actual nature preserves. You might see a sign that says it's a nature preserve, but if you don't see a sign of this triangle back in the background of this slide here, this is the only sign that indicates a nature preserve, a true nature preserve. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amy, and thank you for sticking with me through that tour of Illinois.
All right, thanks, Matt. You're probably wondering, so if all of this exists and we have all of these beautiful places of biodiversity throughout the state, and we already have a system in place, then why is there even a Friends of Illinois Nature Preserves group? One of the reasons, and Matt, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. One of the reasons is because we have all that biodiversity and we have all of these beautiful remnants of our natural areas in Illinois, and people don't know that they exist. And so we in Illinois, one of the things that I think, as someone who has lived in many parts of the state, we in Illinois have an inferiority complex about our natural areas. As Matt just showed you, we have beaches and dunes and swamps, and we have hill prairies with cliffs and bluffs, and we have prairies that go on as far as the eye can see. And we have this beauty in Illinois that I think is unlike any other place in the country. And so part of what we want to do is celebrate that. But the other reason that a friends group exists is because of this slide that's in front of you right now. And that is that the nature preserve system is a very complex system of law and bureaucracy and partners. There are government agencies and other partners, conservation, elected officials, volunteers, landowners, the media, local communities. It's a complicated web, because it's the beauty of the system, and the complicated part of the system is that many agencies own nature preserves, individual citizens, government agencies, conservation districts, land trusts, and Friends of Illinois Nature Preserves really wants to help to facilitate those effective partnerships and provide care. And so on this next slide, you'll see there are 613 nature preserves and land and water reserves throughout the state. The state has the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission. There are 9 staff assigned to each of those regions. You can see actually Area 1, which is your area for most of you, is vacant currently. It's been underfunded. There are staff, but even the agencies that own the nature preserves, the land trusts, the conservation districts, nobody has enough resources to provide the care that these nature preserves need. So that's a little bit about the bureaucracy and a little bit about the complex web, but just a quick story, I think, to show you what happens when people are not involved and not connected. So a case study a little bit about Riverside Prairie. So Riverside Prairie, you can see this photo on the left was taken in 1907 and you can see on the right, it was taken from the spot where the red arrow is. And you can see this wide open prairie with prairie dock. And you can see that the scientist that took that, he visited that over several decades. And he found that over those several decades, the prairie shrank in size from 10 acres to 3 acres. And now you can see that picture on the left. Let's compare it with that same spot. It was returned, somebody returned that same spot and took a picture, and you can see that it's overgrown with buckthorn. And so that's what happens when you remove human beings from the care of their natural areas. We start to lose the prairie and it's invaded. There was no longer fire and there was no longer care of that site. And so it started to become degraded. So let's flash forward now to where we are, that we need to continue to connect people to their natural areas, that humans are citizens of Illinois, are not separate from nature, but we are part of that. We know that our land use and human impacts have changed dramatically, that our ecosystems, many of them are fire dependent. We have so many threats with habitat reduction for our threatened and endangered species. We have fragmentation. And so we have all these pressures put on our natural areas by invasive species, and that we know that climate change is also leaving many of our natural areas and many of our species vulnerable. So it may seem that it can be overwhelming and that there's nothing we can do, but we actually know that our natural areas, that they need these just 5 things. They need frequent prescribed fire for most of our Illinois ecosystems. They need invasive weed management. They need restoration of the degraded areas and the buffer areas. They need regular site monitoring, people paying attention. We'll talk more about that later as well. And they need monitoring of species of conservation concern. And they need all of that. And those resources aren't available completely just with the system as it exists right now. The state doesn't have enough resources. Individual landowners don't have enough resources. And so Friends formed so that we could continue to provide and to support the resources needed for our Illinois nature preserves. So I'm going to turn it back over to Matt for a few minutes to talk a little bit more about the Friends mission and kind of the pillars of our mission.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, so the Friends mission is summed up to preserve, protect, and promote the interests of the nature preserve system. So raising the profile of the system, securing increased resources for the nature preserve system. Here's Orland Grassland, which is in Cook County, advocating for the preservation of biodiversity in our state, even when it's not a nature preserve, but what would be called an area of commission concern, a grade A gravel prairie that is worth advocating for, just like a nature preserve, even if it's not preserved yet. Here, a volunteer steward on the right is trained by a state staff person on the left to lead prescribed burns at a small preserve. So supporting the staff enables the friends to free the staff up to do other work at needier sites, or maybe just we can all cover more ground together. And then another key pillar is to establish constituency for the nature preserves. That means beyond the choir, within the choir, whoever's willing to come out and help to support and understand the nature preserve that's nearest to them. The Friends is interested in working with those people, or Friends are interested in working with those people in order to get out in the preserves and actually empower community engagement. This is the way that we change the world and take the invasive species out of our nature preserves and begin the process of healing and supporting the ones that are healthy. And we need people who are going to be empowered to be out there without a staff person around and knowing what they're doing. And so Friends tries to support that through training and also getting out there together to sort of work with the staff to empower volunteers. And with that, people connect to nature in a way that we really need in the 21st century in order to live a more sustainable life and pass something better on to the people who come after us. And so when we connect people with nature, we also connect people with each other. And that has been one of the most inspiring things about volunteer stewardship that I've learned even before the Friends existed. And many of us, like I was introduced as the founding president of this organization. That's because we needed to establish 3 board members in order to become an organization. But the reason we did it was because we all felt so connected with each other and nature that we wanted to share that with others. And so here's an example of a model for that. This is called the Somme Preserves. This is a part of the state in the Cook County Forest Preserves where savanna in the, or prairie in the red here, savanna in the orange, and woodland in the yellow all exist in their sort of natural assemblage on the landscape. And so you can see here in 1939 in the photo at the bottom that this was mostly an open habitat, our region, and now we have a lot of tree growth and invasive species that have taken over our open grassland and savannas. But here at the Somme Preserves, people are preserving this rich grade A remnant prairie and the savanna that comes along with it. These prairies didn't always look like they were healthy. Here's one that is getting surrounded by shrubs. This is Somme Prairie. At the beginning of the time when people started to restore it, this is what was left. And they said, wow, clearly we need to help this out. This is struggling and it's rich and it can expand. And so now Somme Prairie is very large and expansive, open and full of prairie plants everywhere after the volunteer stewardship. But here you can see people used to engage with the preserves in a different way. And so changing our culture to value these places in a way that supports them is incredibly healthy. And so a long time ago in the late 1970s, the North Branch Prairie Project was established by volunteer individuals who were recognizing the decline of this prairie ecosystem in Cook County along the North Branch of the Chicago River. And so they gathered professionals and the Forest Preserve staff, teachers, biologists from around the area to talk about organizing volunteer stewardship throughout the North Branch. And now those preserves have people that spend time picking the seeds of prairie phlox, which you can see here at the beginning of June. It's a beautiful time to be out in the preserve and be with each other. And this really started on the North Branch of the Chicago River, where people started coming back together. It was a population center, so it's not surprising that maybe Chicago is where some of this volunteer stewardship really started to take off and gain popularity, but it's spread across the state. And people all over are doing work days that are holding work days or volunteer days that look just like this, and seminars to teach each other about the value of prescribed burning and seeding these nature preserves and other biodiversity reserves that are around the state. This model doesn't just apply to the nature preserves. You could take the model of volunteer stewardship, which is just a community of people who lead, learn, and work together to any kind of preserve in the state. And so at the forefront of oak conservation, oak ecosystem conservation, was this volunteer stewardship community that was emerging in Northern Illinois and starting to provide not only valuable solutions and results for the ecosystems, but also for our understanding of the ecosystems, which ultimately compounds our ability to help what survives now and restore what has been lost. And so these conservation stewards on a volunteer basis, we're doing good science and providing valuable results. This is documented well. It's an amazing story of pioneering this work in our state. And so some of the work that these volunteers have done has actually led to a non-nature preserve attaining high enough ecological quality to be dedicated as a nature preserve. It was one of the first times that that's ever happened. A farm field from 1939 in our original photo I showed you at the beginning of this section was then turned into a rich, beautiful savanna supporting eastern prairie white-fringed orchids, marsh speedwells, red-headed woodpeckers nest there every single year, and a community of people who are dedicated and truly care so much about this place that they're there every weekend. They hold work days every weekend and also during the week for those folks who can make it. And through this work, a big community forms of people who become friends, and they start to engage the preserves differently. Here you can see people celebrating around a solstice bonfire in 2017, whereas in 1977, it was called the party spot for teenagers to get into trouble. And so lessons learned from the Somme preserves for what makes a successful community of volunteer stewards in achieving their goals and building community is that species only survive in suitable habitat. Our rare plants need their rare ecosystems. And so you can see this eastern prairie white-fringed orchid is caged here because its habitat has changed to having about 100 times as many deer per square mile as it did naturally. So, and fewer orchids. And so restoring the whole ecosystem is critical. And if you can't do something about something like deer, we can't do anything about the deer here in Cook County, really. So we need to sometimes cage the plants. Another lesson is that in order for them to set seed, that's a whole other topic. And then so another lesson is that good restoration is possible. It can take decades, if not truly understanding ecosystem restoration in the terms of centuries is probably the right way, because these ecosystems developed since the retreat of the last glacier. So that's about 100 centuries. And so if a consistent effort is there, the volunteers can restore ecosystems in human lifetimes and see huge changes over the course of just a few years. And so Somme was an equal partnership between staff, volunteers, scientists, community members, and all others who ever laid a hand on it. And so this is it takes a village in order to come together like this, but it can start small. And so it doesn't need to start off with 50 people or have 20-person regular volunteer days on the weekends. Just a few people who care about a site that they live nearby is really what the Friends is trying to encourage around the state, and also what the Somme preserves have proved works. And so that's why this example is here. It grew from something very small. And then another lesson is that active support and empowerment from partners, volunteers, and a sense of ownership of a site, or ownership of seed collecting, or ownership of storing the tools at your house, that really draws an individual in closer to the community, makes you feel like you're contributing and part of what motivates you to continue the work. And then eventually, as your vision changes from those who sort of show you about the natural world in our region, you just can't walk away. It's too beautiful every season of the year, and the work you're doing, you understand is so important. And so people from all walks of life are interested in this work, especially nowadays where everyone's hearing about environmental concerns, climate anxiety, and people will rise to the occasion given the chance. And so the Friends of the Illinois Nature Preserves is trying to show people that in Illinois, we have a rich history of this work, doing something about our environmental crises, doing something about biodiversity decline, and that there are opportunities to connect with many organizations and the Friends of the Illinois Nature Preserves in order to get out there and start to do something about this. And if you want, start communities in your region or town that will meet at the nature preserves and start to help take care of it and understand it. So the final thing is that these communities should be replicated. That's a big mission of the Friends, is to take that Somme Preserves model, which we will show you. There's another example coming up here, and replicate that across the state. And so Langham Island is a rare place.
Do you want me to do this one?
Did I what?
Do you want me to do
Oh
this
yeah,
one?
sure, please. Yeah.
I
Sorry.
thought you might
Yeah.
need a break. So
Thank you.
yeah. So Langham Island, so as Matt just talked about, for decades, there was a community being built that was caring for the preserves at Somme. And that's where, as he's mentioned, the Friends vision comes from saying, we want a community of people that care about this. And so the Friends vision really says, let's take this and start spreading it throughout the nature preserves throughout the state of Illinois. And so we're just going to tell you about one of them, about Langham Island. Also, because I think Langham Island, it tells us that it's not just the model will be updated and tweaked for each nature preserve because they are all unique. So what works in Northbrook, the model of having a volunteer community that is empowered and that they come and they work and they learn and they lead. That's the model. What it looks like at different nature preserves may be different. Langham Island is located in the Kankakee River within the Kankakee River State Park. It's got a soft spot in my heart because it was the first place where I went to do a Friends workday. And I did it on April 1st of last year. The temperature was forecasted to be 35 degrees high. And the way you get to Langham Island is to take a boat with volunteers across the river. And the day was beautiful and fabulous because you're surrounded by volunteers who not only do they care for the island and for the plants and the animals on the island, but they are forming a community who are generally curious about the people that show up and care about them and want to learn about them and be connected. But what's also amazing about Langham Island is that it's the home to some of Illinois' rarest plant species, including the Kankakee mallow. And Langham Island is the only place where this plant still grows in its native habitat. And the survival of this species in the wild, though, was under threat because of overgrown brush and invasive species, as you can see in the background of this photo. And what happens is that people show up and our nature preserves need the maintenance and consistent care. And as Matt pointed out, it does take a village. This site, as with many of our nature preserves, can be challenging to get to. And for decades, people have been kept out of them and they become forgotten. And so Langham Island is a perfect example of that. It's hard for the state staff that own this site and that are responsible for it, for them to get there on a consistent basis. Because of lack of resources. And so the volunteer community shows up multiple times each month. They show up, they remove invasive species, they collect seeds, they process the seeds, and these are volunteers that become incredibly committed. And on this next slide, you'll see one of the volunteers that shows up regularly to Langham Island wearing his Kankakee mallow shirt. He not only on the work days when the boat is available does he show up, but many times he shows up to go scout the island or to check on things. So when it's warm enough, he'll put on his waders and he'll wade across the river, or he'll bring his own boat, his own canoe or kayak to the site. So this is the type of passion that it becomes inspired in people when they are empowered. None of these people are paid to be there, but they are empowered to take care of it because they love the site and they have formed a genuine community. In fact, during this time of the year, they can't get to Langham Island because of the ice on the river. And so they are so committed to being a part of that community that they're actually actively seeking places to provide care during the winter when they can't get to their beloved island. And so I find that to be incredibly inspiring. So we want to spend just a couple of minutes. I know we want to save some time for questions at the end to talk about one more natural area. So we've spent a lot of time talking about kind of our Friends' mission to grow good care with, I say boots on the ground and loppers in hand care for our natural areas and the nature preserve system. But Friends also really know that it has to be more than that, that we also need to be providing education and advocacy for our natural areas, for our remnants. Some of them are INAI sites, and they are natural area sites that haven't yet been legally protected protected. And so in one such case that we have Bell Bowl Prairie. And there's a couple of pictures that Matt can scroll through here that will show you some of the rich biodiversity here at Bell Bowl Prairie. And I would imagine that many of you are familiar with Bell Bowl Prairie, owned by the Greater Rockford Airport Authority. And if you're not familiar, I'm sure I'll give you a really quick update about kind of what has happened in the last several years. So there's a lot of words on this slide, but basically we know that in 1917, it was recorded that Bell Bowl Prairie was there. It was also known as Camp Grant Prairie. And many times since the airport has owned this remnant prairie, approximately 8,000 years old, but they have owned this land since 1946, when they became the Greater Rockford Airport Authority. But we know that it was saved by Dr. Egbert Fell in 1957. It was saved by Governor Sam Shapiro in 1968. It was saved again by Sinisippi Audubon and the Natural Land Institute in 1967. And at that time, in the late 70s and early 80s, the Rockford Airport acknowledged that this was important. It was an important part of our natural history, and it was important to preserve it. And they would work with the Natural Land Institute to preserve it and to save it. And so we were all shocked to learn that in September that the airport planned on destroying the prairie for their expansion plans. And so throughout the fall, throughout September and October, advocates were working on basically any measures to get the airport to not destroy the prairie, political, public, and legal options. And in September, the airport agreed to put a temporary hold on construction until November 1st. So in October, public pressure built. There were a lot of grassroots movements to advocate for saving the prairie. And in late October, on the 26th, the Natural Land Institute filed a lawsuit for injunctive relief. And NLI really held off on doing that because they wanted to maintain open dialogue and conversation with the airport and the authorities to have the prairie saved. But that didn't seem possible. On October 28th, the airport agreed that they would reopen consultation and that construction would be suspended. And conservationists celebrated, but celebrated cautiously because construction is tentatively scheduled to resume on March 1st. And so this next slide just quickly shows you where the prairie is. And where the road is basically going to go right through the middle of some really high quality remnant prairie. And that matters because, as this next slide will show you, this picture of Illinois prairie in the early 1800s on the left, that's how much prairie we had in the early 1800s. And on the right, there's a little tiny red dot. That's how much total remaining prairie we have today. So some may say that saving just 14 acres of prairie, remnant prairie, isn't important, but it's so vanishingly rare that it is incredibly valuable and important to save. As we were working with many partners, thinking about how do we have a movement that is successful and that gets people to pay attention and agencies and organizations to do things. One of the things we know is that local constituency matters. So it matters that volunteers show up at Langham Island and show up at Somme and all the nature preserves because they're the eyes and the ears and the feet on the ground and know what's happening. We also have learned that the laws aren't written to stop bad development, but that doesn't mean that the people and the actions of citizens can't still stop that. Social media and traditional media matter. In having a movement for trying to save our natural areas, having a place for people to go to find information is really, really important. but also a decentralized movement that allows good things to happen faster. No one needed to wait for Friends of Illinois Nature Preserves to give them permission to do things. It required that many different organizations and individuals were all taking action. But it also means that sometimes there's conflict and sometimes there are different approaches and different views on how things should work. And that's what happens with an empowered and decentralized movement, but it still can work. The other thing that is so important is that our local government matters. We showed lots of pictures of dozens and dozens of people providing care with, removing invasive species and conducting prescribed fire. But those decisions that happen by 5, 7, or 9 people at a local government level have such a critical impact on the natural areas and important. And so we encourage conservationists to make sure they're paying attention at the local government level, because that's where so many of these decisions that get made. And INAI states that are owned by public agencies need to be permanently protected now because similar conflicts can keep happening. And we still have many Illinois natural areas that are not protected by the law that makes them nature preserves still. And we also need to support our local officials who care about protecting our natural areas. And we need to continue to provide them with education. Just because an elected official wins an election and takes office doesn't mean that they are immediately bestowed with all the knowledge they need to make those decisions. And many times what happens is that we don't take action and start educating them until we're in a crisis mode and emotions are high. And we need to be doing that on a more regular basis. So a little bit more advocacy work, what you can do for Balboa Prairie. If you haven't already, visit the websites, follow Save Balboa Prairie on Facebook, complete the IEC action alert, write to the governors, to the Governor Pritzker and the senators. If you have contacts with the media, make sure you are contacting them and encouraging them to get the word out. We are raising funds to help cover the legal fees. And I think Matt put the link in the chat. And there is more information. We've been having monthly meetings to keep the public informed. And so the next one will be on a week from today at 6 p.m. on Zoom. And tell other people what you know. There are still many people who don't know what Balboa Prairie is and why that matters, and why saving it matters. And so we hope that you would do that as well. So I think Matt's going to wrap up here really quickly, and then we'll have some time for questions.
So how can you and I help the nature preserves? Thanks for listening to this. This is step 1, I guess. This is a really good way to understand what the nature preserves are, to attend a meeting or a talk by a group that's trying to promote nature preserve conservation, and to get out there and work in the preserves as a volunteer. You can share your knowledge about the nature preserves and what you've learned about biodiversity, even if it's just what you learned tonight. You can advocate for biodiversity by voting down the ballot and talking to and engaging with elected officials. As Amy said, the local government level is so important for this land. And then visiting a nature preserve and filling out a site report, which can be found on the Friends of Illinois Nature Preserves website, is great. If there's one that you visit all the time, maybe you don't have to rush into doing a report on it or anything, but even something like, hey, there's European buckthorn on the west side. It's a pretty big thicket. It's coming into the prairie. Something like that is a great way to help sound the alarm a little bit and maybe galvanize some people to get out there and help organize to do something about it. So there's considering dedicating the sites that are eligible, which is an Illinois Natural Areas Inventory site. And if it's not that yet, you can register it as an inventory site before it becoming a nature preserve. It does have to be of sufficient ecological quality though. And then consider launching a stewardship community. This is the #1 thing. And if you need help with that, you can reach out to the Friends of the Illinois Nature Preserves. That's the idea behind the organization. So with that, we've launched a couple more this year. We've only existed for a little while, since 2019. And so the Friends of the Illinois Nature Preserves, the volunteers organizing around a couple old sites with new volunteer communities, I should say, out all over the state, as far south as south goes almost in Illinois, and then all the way up to Kishwaukee Fen in Northwest Illinois. And so with that, I hope that you guys have enjoyed the presentation about the Friends of the Illinois Nature Preserves, what a nature preserve is, why Bell Bowl Prairie matters, and why biodiversity is important even here in Illinois, where we might not think that we have a ton of biodiverse ecosystems, but we do. So thanks to Gary and to Don Miller, who isn't here tonight, but helped organize. And we really appreciate your time. And thanks for being such a great audience. And we're happy to answer questions.
Sure. We've got, there was a question in the chat asking, how are you funded? How are you funded as far as, is it bound? Yeah.
Yeah, so so Friends of Illinois Nature Preserves, primarily, I mean, we are a donations-based organization. So Friends of Illinois Nature Preserves applied for a grant from the Illinois Clean Energy Community Foundation for a capacity building grant. So that allowed for them to hire me. And then we've continued to, part of that capacity building is building kind of our donor database and basically soliciting for donations as well. And so that's part of what we're doing as we've been working this past year as well. So providing care and then also saying, and we need funding.
Okay. And just a reminder, Laura reminds us that the Northwest Illinois Audubon does stewardship days at our Freeport Prairie. We're not an official friends, but we do help out a bit. But would there be a benefit or a value in partnering together with, we have a local prairie in town, that type of thing? I mean, what would you suggest in that regard?
Yeah, I think that, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay. My little box isn't lighting up when I talk. So first thing is, you don't need to be a friends organization. I just heard that a little bit in the question, like, would it help to be a friends organization? No, it doesn't. It's not. That's just a nonprofit status so that we can receive donations, and that makes things easier for being a nonprofit and raising money for this work. But the partnering with the Friends of Illinois Nature Preserves to like sort of get the community going is absolutely something that you guys can do. And Freeport Prairie is so deserving of it. Freeport Prairie Nature Preserve is an amazing site. And on the Friends website, there are some resources like stewardship guide or a guide to common stewardship activities. But there's so much more that goes into it that we're still developing resources for, like guides to how to bring people together, guides to sort of like how to divide the labor or whatever like that. So those things can be learned and sort of discussed and supported through friends, individuals. And we're hoping next year to hire, potentially if we get enough funding, someone to sort of be a field rep for Northwestern Illinois, where people will be able to work with someone like me or Amy, who knows about the ecosystem and also about the community side of things, to be able to just show up to the first couple work days and get it off the ground.
Okay. And then the other thing, when we after we've wrapped up, after we've finalized the recording, we do send a copy of that out to the entire group that's been online, as long as and also we will have this recording available. But if you could include you could forward a couple different of your email addresses and websites, that type of thing, and email to us, and we'll make sure that goes out with the recording for people that are interested in following up further.
And we can also send, Gary, we can send you a PDF of the slideshow too, if that is helpful to put with the video link.
Okay.
And I see people are commenting that there is some stewardship activity going on through Northwest Audubon, and I figured that, yeah, you guys are the constituency, at least a piece of it, and so I believe it. Just keep doing that stewardship work and try to make it even more frequent, and you'll be surprised to see what happens to the ecosystem and the human community. It's really a wonderful thing to watch grow.
And James had a comment about some recently discovered remnant prairies, and that keeps popping up. And I think, so one of the things, other reason that Friends of Illinois Nature Preserves is also, I think, necessary or needed is that So if somebody from the state of Illinois comes and they are a state employee, comes knocking on your door as a landowner and says, you have this precious prairie and you should protect it forever, but you are a government employee, there may be some mistrust there. But some of the things that Friends can do also is, as a nonprofit and as representatives, we can sometimes have those landowner conversations as well and explain the process and explain why what they have is special and should be protected. And so kind of on that slide that we showed of untangling the web, sometimes that's a process that we can help with as well, is to find out, okay, how do we have these landowner conversations, but also figuring out, does the nature preserve staff know about these remnants, and untangling the web. I think you also mentioned that the heritage biologist knows, but does the IDNR is its own web of complicated bureaucracy. And so helping untangle those things can also be something that we might be able to help with. Yeah, because protecting them is definitely important.
By NPC in the comment, Jennifer, do you mean the Nature Preserve Commission?
Yes.
Yeah, so the Illinois Nature Preserve Commission is, yes, we actually just established an MOU. We just, is that the right word for that? Yeah, we just
Yeah.
have an MOU now with the Nature Preserve Commission, our first one, so hopefully that will continue to grow. And we have a time slot at every Nature Preserve Commission meeting to give updates, and the commission itself has welcomed the increased advocacy, raising the profile of the system, and the volunteer boots on the ground work, of course.
And two of the commissioners on the Illinois Nature Preserve Commission are sitting on our board recruitment task force. So they're not on our board, but they are working with us as we develop the board as well. So there's it's been some good overlap and some good communication, and finally an actual formalized memorandum of understanding as well.
So backing up just let's play a 2020 hindsight game, and let's say at some point, let's say 10 years ago, that the Bell Bowl Prairie was declared a natural area or natural preserve, and had the triangular sign and stuff like that. Would that have stopped all this shenanigans from this point forward in regards to it would have been protected forever?
Yes, there have been many times when I have said, wait, when they saved this prairie in 1970, whatever, why didn't they finish doing the job? And because, so the part of the beauty of the Illinois system is that it's a landowner. It's not a nature preserve designation. It's not imposed upon the land or the landowner. It's a dedication. The landowner gets to make the decision. And so in many cases, it's such a beautiful and powerful thing. They have said, this is so important that we are preserving it in perpetuity. The frustrating thing is when you have a landowner that knows better and said something in the 1970s about how important it was, and then didn't actually follow through. It was words, but they didn't follow through with the action of actually dedicating it. And we all would have saved a lot of time in October because it would be irrelevant. They could not have built a road.
Yeah, it would have been a moot point. They would already worked the way around it anyways, because they would have recognized that they can't touch it. But
yes,
keep pushing. Anybody else online have any questions? I think you can unmute yourself if you do. You don't necessarily, if you feel more comfortable asking versus typing, either way.
I'd like to think that the nature preserve designation is the end of the story, and yay, happily ever after. I do remember 20, 30 years ago, a little place called Brookville, Illinois. There was a nice little prairie there. It was and adjoining a cemetery, and that's how a lot of prairies wound up being preserved. Nobody plowed it because it was a cemetery. And then all of a sudden, the cemetery only decided they wanted to start burying people in the beautiful part of the prairie, and the Nature Preserve Commission said, nope, you can't.
And then
I'm
thinking this is almost done.
One of our legislators went to bat for the cemetery and yeah, they ripped up that section of prairies. So it's not inviolate.
I think that's a great point because, and that's why that constituency, that's why having that community of people that care and are care with boots on the ground, but also care about and are communicating and educating landowners and elected officials. You're right. It's never a done deal. It's, I ask somebody, I'm like, how do you know when you're done with restoration? And they kind of just, how do you know when this is received enough care? How do you know when you can move on? And they just kind of smile and like, no, you can't. It will, just like it's dedicated in perpetuity, it will need care from human beings in perpetuity at all levels, in advocacy and in boots on the ground.
So a question just showed up. Is there a critical size necessary to have a viable nature preserve?
Nature preserves legally have to be 1 acre.
Okay.
And they range from 1 acre to 4,000 acres. Goose Lake Prairie Nature Preserve. Oh, sorry.
I
But here's
had written down a couple questions and let me see if we've already covered them. Oh, I'm just kind of interested. Have you seen an increase in interest in communities getting together and starting this process based upon the fact that we've been in the pandemic for the last couple of years and people are more prone to be outside and working? Have you seen an increase in interest in that regards?
What would you say, Amy?
I think that, yes, there has been an increased interest. I think it is combined with the opportunity to be outside, and that's been a safe place and a safe thing to do. I think also our increasing awareness of how much of our biodiversity reserves are being lost, the impact on climate change. And we know that, I can't go off and save the rainforest, but I can go to a nature preserve that is a 5-minute drive from my house or even an hour drive from my house. And I am doing something that makes a difference. And so I think those factors combined have made a difference. One of the things that we often talk about is that it's not a lack of people who are willing to come out and bring their loppers and cut down buckthorn or even do the herbiciding. Many times it's a lack of leaders, and it really, the model is that it takes a community also of leaders. Having one leader at a site only it's not as sustainable. And so having a community that are working together, making those decisions and working together to all lead together is really what we're trying to build. And that's part of the model. So we need more people who want to lead.
Another question popped up. Who are the scientists who determine what is native and what is invasive?
That is a loaded question. You could spend hours talking about the definitions between invasive and non-invasive and native and non-native. But Matt, I'll let you take the rest of that one if you want.
Sure. I think so. There are so the Illinois Natural Areas Inventory, the INAI, was started by state biologists in the 70s, and they combed the state and found the precious remnants that are left. And they did that by identifying the rich assortment of prairie plants, for the most part, savanna prairie, that are left in these little untouched parcels. And so it's state botanists, state biologists, and other scientists across the state. But at this point, with so little left, it was all pretty much found. There are still, of course, little places where you might find some blazing stars or prairie docks on the side of the road and stuff like that. But the really rich, larger sites have mostly been found, and they were documented by the state and other scientists from the Morton Arboretum, the Chicago Botanic Garden, Northeast Illinois University, and SIU, Southern Illinois University, and of course the Illinois Natural History Survey out of Champaign-Urbana. So all the top dogs in the state.
Okay. All right. Any other questions before we let our guests leave?
How large is the Bellbowl remnant?
The Bellbowl Prairie that's left now is 14 acres total out of 20 that were there, but the airport has already destroyed some. And the high quality grade A irreplaceable is about 6 acres. But importantly, the Friends and other conservationists around the state would say those other acres that are in degraded shape are restorable. And the valuable thing about that area is that there's grade A and there's restorable prairie next to it. And that restorable prairie is invaluable because the soil is still undisturbed there. It was never plowed. So it's still a remnant soil, which might have the biodiversity that's even rare, the microbes, the soil organisms that are associated with perennial grasslands. And so that is an important part of the preserve. But about 6 acres are grade A, nothing else like it. And that 6 acres is out of a total of 18 in the state.
Well, seeing no more questions in the queue, I'm going to assume that we don't have any more questions. At this point, I'm going to shut the recording off, and then